Thanks very much, John. Our third speaker and final speaker this evening is Therese Moriarity. Ms. Moriarty is a historian of the women's labour movement based in Dublin, a member of the committee of the Irish Labour History Society. She has written the life of Mary Galway, the Belfast trade unionist, and indeed she confirmed for me that it was James Connolly who described the women linen workers as the linen slaves of Belfast. Can we show our appreciation for Ms. Moriarty?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to contribute to this discussion. I hope what I go on to say justifies it. I suppose when all eyes are really directed towards the site of that sort of iconic slipway this week, it is a timely moment perhaps to take a glancing look at least at Belfast's other great industry of linen. 100 years ago, Ireland's oldest and largest industry dominated the daily life of Belfast. Just over 10% of the city's entire population of women, men and children worked in linen manufacturing. Among the 35,000 or so strong linen workforce, 26,500 of them were women. And in 1911, half of the city's manufacturing workforce was women. This was completely sort of unique in any sort of city profile that you could compare with at the time. And among the 50 to 60,000 linen workers of combining of County Down and Antrim, which takes in the Belfast city area, over 13,000 of the linen workers were under the age of 18, and a third of those were half-timers, children under the age of 14. So the daily rhythms of Belfast's busy streets really beat the pattern of the linen workers' industrial time clocks. Dashing from the bedroom into the street at the sound of the shrieking steam whistles of the mills and factories, foodless but half awake, wrote one of these mill workers. From the girl of 13 up to the grey-haired woman of 60 years, one may see them pouring through the streets, to and fro from their workrooms at 6 in the morning, at 1 going to midday meals, or at 6 or 7 in the evening returning to their homes, a brief respite to swallowing the evening meal of tea, bread and margarine. And reflecting on the working conditions that she went on to write, whether we contemplate the circumstances under which the girl works in the vapour of the spinning room with bare feet and saturated clothing, or amid the whir and crackling of the weaving shed, or guiding the seesaw of the sewing machines, all the surroundings are servile and monotonous, and of course they were all hazardous and underpaid. Women's wages, around 10 shillings a week, could be a little more, could be a little less, were often kind of cut to bare threads by a fine system that operated within the in all three of those places of work, the mills, the factories and the warehouses, and where machines malfunctioned or there was something wrong with the thread or the cloth wasn't coming out, this could absolutely halve the rate of pay through this fine system, one of the major grievances. Behind the front door, along any red brick terrace, the Lancashire writer James Haslam met a woman embroidering linen handkerchiefs at 7p a dozen. She could finish a dozen of them a day. 2 of her 5 children helped her in the task. An 8-year-old was actually out at the time fetching more handkerchiefs from the warehouse, and as they talked, the waiting mother took the chance to scour her fire irons as she waited the new batch of work. Another child was upstairs, slowly dying from an unnamed but fatal disease. This mother fitted her domestic duties around the working day. To do that, she got up at 5 in the morning, doing the housework, and took other breaks for other household demands. She laboured then till 10 or 11, maybe 12 o'clock at night. Her effort, she saw, was dedicated to getting her son a trade. She was paid 3 and 6 a week, which covered the gas and the coal of the household, and her labourer husband, who earned 12 shillings a week, put the food on the table. And the handkerchiefs that she made sold for 8 shillings to 9 shillings and sixpence a dozen in Belfast, Glasgow, Liverpool, Birmingham, London. She was paid 7p for the dozen. Belfast linen workers were not only highly visible coming and going on the streets 100 years ago, or in such published anecdotes as these that I've just given, but were showing up alarmingly in large numbers and uniquely at in their younger and reproductive years in the city's death rates from TB. From 1900 to 1902, almost 1,000 women between the ages of 25 and 45 died of TB in Belfast, compared with 638 men. The numbers that came closest to Belfast's relatively young women were older men in Manchester, which they compared with Belfast as another textile city. Underlying these stark numbers was the pernicious system of the child labour in the mills, which lasted until 1918-1920. Half-time schooling, where children attended school in the morning and worked in the afternoon, meant exhausted scholars, children who rarely saw the sunshine and whose health was ruined. And one of their teachers told a city health visitor in 1907 that very few of these children ever grew to see their 30th birthday. And there were 4,144 half-timers in Belfast in 1907. The lives of women industrial workers had come under intense public scrutiny from the 1890s. Among the first voices raised on their behalf were among the city trade unions, none of whom included any women among their members. Encouraged by women campaigners such as the Dublin-born May Abraham, the first faltering steps to build unions for women began in 1890. In 1893, the first Irish union formed for women linen workers was launched as the Irish Textile Operative Society of Ireland. The great gulf between the fortunes of the linen industry and the poverty of the women who worked within it gave rise to a chorus of complaint that grew by 1910. Embraced many campaigners, including Margaret Irwin, Scottish industrial reformer, who wrote about the Belfast home workers, Hilda Martindale, who was appointed as Ireland's first woman factory inspector, the Belfast Medical Officer of Health in his annual reports, H.W. Bailey, Joe Devlin, the nationalist MP, issued pamphlets, and in 1910 at the General Assembly, the moderator, Dr. Purvis, spoke out against the exploitation of these women. And all of the rhetoric of these was very detailed, was full of detailed exploitation of like the examples that I've read out earlier, always contrasting poverty and the prosperity of linen, the luxury of the trade and the incredible hardship of the working conditions. But among the best-known voices of that time was Mary Galway. She was born in 1864 and died in 1928. She was General Secretary of the Textile Operative Society of Ireland, and she tirelessly recounted a list of the grievances of the city women workers through her union in the press, at public meetings and in government inquiries. She followed Susan Cockbill as the Textile Operatives General Secretary and Organiser, but she became the union's first full-timer in 1901. Before this, she had been a handkerchief stitcher herself, Mary Galway. She held this position for 31 years, and she was a member of the Belfast Trades Council until 1913, and she was elected as the first and only woman on the National Trade Union All-Ireland Executive Committee from 1907. In 1910, she was elected by that body as the first woman vice president, although she never became the president the following year, as was the general custom. Ireland's trade union movement was unique in having a woman executive member at that time. In Britain and the United States, both of whom had much older trade union, national trade union bodies than the Irish one, which had begun in 1894, no women would sit on their executives till many years later, let alone a woman become a vice president. In 1897, when Mary Galway began her term as the trade union secretary, there were 10 unions in the linen industry, and 9 of them excluded women. By 12, 3 unions were recruiting them as members. From 1906, the Men's Flax Roughers Trade Union added yarn spinners to their name to admit women mill workers in their union. And this followed the drawn-out dispute of 1906, when the spinners struck with success at winning a pay increase of 10%, which would bring their wages from 10 shillings. And the weavers who joined the strike lost out after many weeks on strike. This dispute of 24,000 women strikers, and which absolutely halted the linen trade in the city through those months, exposed, in a sense, the fault lines on which perhaps the Textile Operative Society had been formed. Whilst only a single union of women was able to gather the numbers together to have the staying power to survive, the linen production itself, of course, was a highly segregated process. Mills, factories and warehouses where spinning, weaving and stitching took place were separate sites, and workers within them were accorded very different status. So the separate standing of the mill worker to the weaver to the machine stitcher or the hand embroiderer was quite an important aspect of this separation. And the geography, of course, also kept them apart. There wasn't any one unified sort of territory, if you like, in the city where the linen workers were. The places of work were throughout the city. And to some extent, this separation undermined united action and perhaps sometimes even exacerbated differences, as the 1906 strike outcome, where the spinners leave and join another union, or suggest. And this was repeated, of course, in 1911 when James Connolly set up an Irish textile workers' union after a dispute at the York Street Mill in the autumn of 1911. And again, it seems that the spinners opted for a different union to the Textile Operative Society, or quite explicitly, in fact. They didn't want to be in Mary Galway's union, as they told him. Before 1914, none of the three unions ever represented more than a fragment of the linen workforce of women. Connolly's union never grew beyond maybe 300 members. Mary Galway's union, textile operatives, grew to 10,000 members during the First World War. But as linen industry itself began to decline from the 1920s, the numbers of that in that union began to decline back to the pre-war levels of about 3,000, always moving around 2,000 to 3,000. Eventually, all three of the Irish unions for women linen workers disappeared into larger general unions who had their headquarters in London. The era that sort of represented, I suppose, particularly before the war, First World War, from the 1900s, was a very pioneering one. And each of these three unions would appoint women officers. No other unions had full-time women officers, although they did have kind of women that held certain positions if they had women and men members. Some of them did, but it was the linen workers that actually had women employed as organisers. The national and none of those other unions either had women officers who attended the wider national trade union conferences and councils as delegates until after the Great War. The one exception, of course, to this was the Irish Women Workers' Union, formed in 1911 in Dublin, which Belfast really became a branch of. So did anything unite any of these women? Susan Cockbill, Mary Galway, later Ellen Dunbar in the 1920s, Winifred Carney and Ellen Gordon of the Irish Textile Workers' Union. And they all shared one important, though quite unspoken aspect of their lives. They were all single women. Some may have been called Mrs., but they certainly were either widows or there wasn't a husband about, as in Ellen Gordon was called Mrs. Gordon. Susie Cockbill was a widow. So as indeed were also the next generation of women trade union officers, Betty Sinclair and Sadie Patterson, both of whom came from linen unions. I just kind of remarked on that because certainly it was never a qualification that any of the men among their brother trade unionists were required to be. Those linen workers of the 1900s still keep on giving, and today their granddaughters and great-granddaughters keep their memory alive among many of today's trade union activists in the city. Despite all the clamour about the exploitation of women linen workers 100 years ago, they do not share in any way as a body in any of these upcoming centenaries. The singing and shouting and music that accompanied their walkouts and spread their disputes around the cities from factories and mills, noises often not centre stage in any of the coming decades, not even really in the lockout centenaries, although in 1913 locked out Dublin workers did come north to Belfast to find work. So if there was any centenary, I suppose, that for women workers to celebrate this year, then let it be the centenary of the great Lawrence Mill strike in the US, where so much of the inspiration for women's trade unionism came from, and from which came the women's anthem that's still sung, as it was, at the Waterfront Hall at the beginning of March this year at the Irish Congress of Trade Unions Women's Conference, before, among others, the Irish President Michael D. Higgins, in celebration of the continuity of its aspirations. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. Thanks for listening.